continue with our business of today, which is the introductory chapter of a volume that has been written by Charlotte Bresetton. And no, maybe before we start with our business of today, any questions from your side in terms of administration, organization of the seminar, anything that remained unclear to you so far? So what I can, I think, demonstrate with what we do today, that it is all the time possible if you feel a little bit uncomfortable and you realize maybe something is not okay and you don't want to be a risk to my classmates. When you decide to stay home, it's possible to get you in here via video conferencing, and the same would be possible that you do a text presentation from home. I think our preference should maybe be in class. It doesn't make sense for you to travel across the world and then, or around the world, and then stay all the time in the dorms. But it's possible, it works, and hope that you will not get disconnected. So that's one opportunity that we should have in mind, that we all the time can do everything in a hybrid form that offers us both options to meet in class face to face, but also to invite somebody via video conference. Okay, this contribution from Charlotte Bresetton and John Vogler is about the idea that we can, maybe must, understand the European Union as an actor that goes abroad, that conducts relations to third countries. These third countries are individual countries, these are groups of countries, these are international organizations. And the question is, how do and can we understand the European Union? Because it's not a state. Usually this activeness is automatically, by international law, by international relations theory, most of them attributed to states. I cannot right now because Elias is down today, but I will upload an article the two authors wrote in 2005, 1 year earlier, that deals with this activist debate and where they construct, maybe reconstruct, the activeness of the European Union in a given policy. And this given policy was the climate change policy, the leadership that was exerted by the European Union, and especially the task to get the Kyoto Protocol first ratified and then entering into effect. And they demonstrate this with the behavior and strategy of the European Union that decided, okay, we need to have a certain or meet qualification criteria for the Kyoto Protocol that enters into effect. Since the US abandoned membership in the Kyoto process, it was of utmost importance to guarantee that the Russian Federation is in, because the Russian Federation is in the calculations of the climate change process and the Kyoto Protocol, an important entity that represents a certain amount of carbon dioxide emissions, and only with Russian membership there was a guarantee that the qualification criterion for the ratification process of the Kyoto Protocol was met. And what the European Union did is, hey, Russia, you are pretty much interested in World Trade Organization membership. Together with the US, we, the European Union, are the most important entity within the World Trade Organization. We offer you a deal. You and your Duma ratify the Kyoto Protocol and place the document in Bonn, where the Germany, in Bonn, where the United Nations Framework Convention Secretariat is present. And once this is done, we will get you into the World Trade Organization. And the Russians made up their mind, and finally the Duma ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and the protocol could enter into effect, which was the idea and intention of the European Union. And against this policy process, they develop and figure out how the European Union gained activeness in a given field. They also reflect about other theoretical approaches to understand an entity as an actor and develop their own threefold strategy that I will explain a little bit later. This is a little bit the pattern that I want to do here in class, that we look into certain policy processes and figure out, do we have a European Union that is capable of getting their interests through? Do they speak with one unified voice? Do they have the capacity to do so? Do they have the identity to do so? All these things that finally end up into activeness. I will upload this article, and for those who are interested, they can have a look at this article. It's quite interesting because in the course of this process that the Kyoto Protocol was due to be the strategy of the EU entering into effect, at that time US President George W. Bush changed his mind. He was traveling to Europe, but he didn't want to speak to anyone from the European Union, especially not for the European Parliament. When he realized, okay, Kyoto is going to be reality, he changed his travel plans and asked for delivering a speech in front of the European Parliament. So this is another element of activeness that you are recognized. It's recognition. This is also something that might support your activeness. So I will, to a certain extent, follow the structure of this book chapter, but I will not make myself a slave to the chapter. I will deviate here and then a little bit. And so we will talk about the idea of activeness in international law. We will talk about the idea of activeness in international relations theory. We will briefly talk about this conception that has been suggested and proposed by Brereton and Vogler, and I will keep it short because it should be something that we can apply. It's not something where we should write extensive theoretical thesis about. It's something that we should apply to policies that we will address and discuss here in our seminar, and therefore some little things what to be kept in mind. And of course, you have the opportunity to question whatever you want, and I try to find a possible answer. And when you don't understand something, want to comment something, please intervene and interrupt me in a polite way so that we can have a polite conversation. That's the idea. So we will get some inspiration why this topic is of importance, and especially for someone who is studying the European integration process and part of the outcome of the European. I will upload this on Elias as well, sorry for this late comment. For the study of the outcomes of the European integration process, because when we look into how scholars define, for instance, foreign policy, then this is very much state-centric. So the most definitions of foreign policy that you will find pronounce diplomatic policy of a nation and its interaction with other nations, the policy of a sovereign state in its interaction with other sovereign states. So a leading conception comes into play, the conception of sovereignty, which is usually not admitted to an entity like the European Union. And I found one interesting definition that is taken from Encyclopedia Britannica. I will later tell you why I took this presentation. Usually I do not take definitions. Usually I do not take definitions from encyclopedias. General objectives that guide the activities and relationships of one state in its interactions with other states. The development of foreign policy is influenced by domestic considerations, the policies of behavior of other states, or plans to advance specific geopolitical designs. Leopold von Ranke emphasized the primacy of geography and external threats in shaping foreign policy, but later writers emphasized domestic factors. Diplomacy is a tool of foreign policy, and war, alliances, and international trade may all be manifestations of it. Do you agree?
So, to some extent.
Door seems to be content.
To some extent, yeah.
To some extent, okay. Where does this extent stop?
In some ways, yeah, in some ways not.
Huh?
In some ways, he's right.
He's right. Okay.
In some way.
Mutasam, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think it's comprehensive, and
comprehensive. Okay.
Like diplomacy is the tool of foreign policy. This part of the whole quotation is interesting. Right.
So what we find is a little bit what we got in the descriptions that are above the quotation. One state, diplomacy, what you just mentioned,
Yeah.
Huda, but they also mention international trade.
Yeah.
And this opens a question mark, because when we look at the European Union, then the commercial policy and among commercial policies, trade is an exclusive competence of the European level. So maybe this state-centered approach is kind of misleading. Why did I take this quotation from Encyclopedia Britannica? They refer to Leopold von Ranke. And I was stepping over that name because it's a British entry, it's British media, and they quote an ancient Prussian historian who lived in Prussia, who was born in 1795, and I was made me think, why do they quote such a guy when they have so many big historian names who could do the same definition within the British scientific environment? I didn't find any answer, but what I find interesting is Leopold von Ranke was born in 1795. That is the year when Immanuel Kant published his philosophical sketch, Perpetual Peace.
Okay.
And Perpetual Peace is in thinking much more advanced than this little old-fashioned understanding that foreign policy is shaped by specific or by geography and external threats. So ideas to change things was not in the mind of Leopold von Ranke. Quite interesting that such a renowned encyclopedia like the Encyclopedia Britannica refers to such a guy. I didn't find an answer to the question. I wrote them an email but never got a reply. Poor customer service, you. I'm not a paying customer, maybe that's the reason. Okay. I would like you to remain in this area a little bit and to better understand what the conventional wisdom about activeness in international relations is. We will come to international law and theory a little later, but this is what is maybe accepted by most. We have states, and states interact with each other, and the behavior of state A against B is part of the foreign policy of state A.
Yeah.
And vice versa, the behavior and actions and processes of state B against or with state A are the foreign policy of state B. And the relationship between the state government and the society is, for this perspective and for this consideration, unimportant.
Yes.
It's regardless whether it's a democracy with pluralistic society or a more authoritarian regime that doesn't really take care. For foreign policy, this is first in an assessment unnecessary to be taken into consideration. In some theories, of course, it comes into play. I will come back to this a little later. What states also do, that they sometimes want to organize things. They want to fix things. And to get things fixed for a permanent period, you create something that is an institution. Or here it's an intergovernmental organization. The acronym IGO stands for Intergovernmental Organization. So it's quite clear that we, in international politics, in international relations, understand the state A and state B as actor A and actor B. What about the intergovernmental organization? What would be your answer? Is this an actor or not? What would you say?
It's an actor because it has influence on states or something.
It has influence on states, but isn't it created by states?
No.
Not?
Group
But
of states.
it's intergovernmental.
Intergovernmental means?
It's part of the government.
Intergovernmental means that states join together.
Yeah.
And they usually establish contract or treaty. And with this treaty, they establish such an organization. In the perception principal agent, the story goes, the states are the principals, who want to get a certain thing done, and therefore they need an agency. And this is the intergovernmental organization. And then the organization usually has a clear task. You have to do this. But sometimes, the perception of the world differs from time to time and from person you ask to person you ask. So maybe they need some space to maneuver. So they have a certain policy mandate to fulfill, and they can interpret it in this or that way. So maybe sometimes they need to take decisions. What is the decision-making process? It should be written in the contract. If they want to do something, they need staff. Who is the staff? What about the recruitment policy? Needs to be written down in the treaty. And if you want to do something, you usually can't do anything with empty pockets. You need some money. Budget is also a question. But the question for activeness depends on your worldview.
Okay.
How you perceive the world. So a realist or neo-realist would argue, yes, they do some things, but this is the purpose of creating such an institution. If a state doesn't want that this institution is doing so, they just revoke the mandate, or they leave the institution to the contract. Like the US did in many examples that we could witness over the last years. So it's not activeness, it's to the latest extent maybe landed activeness for a given mandate, a certain period of time, but when they do not do as they are supposed to do, then I raise my finger and I take back the money or take back my membership. What they are of course not is sovereignty, holding sovereignty. They're not sovereign. So going back to the definition before, sovereign states, they are neither state and they are to no extent sovereign. So according to me as a realist or neo-realist, they are not actors. They to a certain extent have a say, but only because I as a state and we as a group of states want them to have a say. That's the argument by state-centric, not only realism, but state-centric theories. Institutionalists would argue differently. They also have certain ideas that are matching with the worldview of realists and neo-realists, but to bring institutionalism to two terms means institutions matter. The argument by institutionalists is the institutionalization of certain policy processes, meaning you bring together certain entities that permanently think about how can we fix this problem, how can we find a proper solution that matches all our interests and ideas, means that they learn quite a lot about all the other partners in that form of cooperation. I know what they desire, I know what is possible, and I remove all the impossible ideas I have in my wish list from the table, because it's not feasible. I will not get a consensus. I need to behave like getting a consensus. So the institution, the permanent institution, is changing a little bit my worldview, my interests, maybe even my norms and values. So it is having a long-term effect on how I behave, what I intend to do, and what I perceive to be impossible. So after being subject to such an institutionalized policy process, in the long run, the entities, the principles that gave a certain mandate to the agent are kind of dependent on the agent. And sometimes even an agent gets so dominant that the agent is capable of telling the principles how to behave and what to do. So they will not reorganize the world order. Finally, states remain sovereign entities and the only sovereign entities. But the institution can create changes and might be of high influence. So therefore, from an institutionalist perspective, it would be an actor. Of course, it would be an actor. This entire interplay between foreign policy A-B, the activation of governmental organizations is what we usually put together in this terminology, international politics, which is what states or governmental bodies do, but not non-governmental organizations. They do not international politics, they are important for international relations, but they do not politics, even though some private companies also speak about the idea that they do public policy which is according to the pure definition of terms not possible. Aline, you can be late. I just want to confirm your presence in the room. This is what I have to check, and I write down the seat numbers so that we know where each other was placed. And you see, you can't see, I can see, just for your knowledge, we have one participant who's with us via video conferencing. Linus, a German student, and he's in isolation due to a friend who was positive, and that you know that there's someone watching into our room. He can see me, he can see the presentation, he cannot see you. And he's smiling right now. Okay.
So where does the EU sense from this whole sense? Right? It's not an intergovernmentalism organization, but it's an international one.
Okay, so that is now the good question that Huda is asking. What about the EU? Where is the EU placed in here? What is the EU? Who wants to give it a try?
I think it depends, because the EU is also an actor, like the UN or other organizations like NAFTA and such on, but it's also combined of actors, because each of the members of the EU is a sovereign state, which is also an actor in the global war. So it's very confusing. It depends on where and what the EU is doing.
So you are at least right in two regards. First, you gave the number one social science then answer. It depends. It was your introduction, depends. That would be worse and extra surprising for its own. And yes, it's very confusing. And it's even confusing to people who perceive themselves as experts in European studies. I started with the example of the Kyoto Protocol. When the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in Kyoto, lots of the responsibility were on the European Union level. For emissions is to a certain extent part of EU's environmental policy. When you have something that is a European competence and it gets into an external dimension, the Commission and the European institutions are in charge and take parts of the competence. Also, before the Kyoto conference was held, the members of the European Union met and they issued a so-called negotiation mandate. In this frame, Commission, Presidency, you can speak on behalf of the entire Union.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? But the US wanted to integrate emission certificates. So money comes into play and how to organize. And in financial affairs, it's a little bit more tricky because for instance, the Council of Ministers, you have unanimity in the voting system. So that was beyond the mandate. And so there was some confusion even within the delegation of the EU, who was in charge of negotiating this piece of the contract of the agreement. Is it the Commission? Is it the Presidency of the Council? Or do we have to give it back to the member states?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really delicate. It's very often confusing certain entities whom to talk to, but sometimes it's even confusing the EU. Because everything must be subject to a certain treaty-based or ECJ, judgment-based legal provision. Otherwise, member states could contest and challenge something, and then, for instance, the treaty would not be valid for the entire European Union. So it's indeed something that is confusing. The reason for why it is so confusing, the process of European integration was not following the grand sketch that some wise people set together. This is the design that we want to have for a modern entity of the 21st century, but it was incremental integration. So some huge steps of integration, but in between incremental developments, something was allowed, deeper integration here, less deep integration there, so that finding the situation, the image of the EU that we have to depict in our minds is a very confusing one indeed. And this is why we have the opportunity to study it. Otherwise it would be too easy, one article done. So the question was where is the EU? And the answer was it depends. And the question is a good one, the answer is a good one as well. So it's quite clear, the European Union is not a state. So classical considerations that define actors via definitions of, for instance, foreign policy will not work. And the idea then is, of course, and this is what we're going to aim for in the seminar, to find alternative approaches to understand and classify the European Union and the activeness of the European Union. But of course, what we have to admit and take into consideration as well is that we are subject to global transformations, to economic interdependence, and the entire process of globalization that not only intensifies and makes salient interconnectedness, and with interconnectedness, interdependencies. We are mutually dependent in many, many situations, but also to take care of non-state actors. So the investment decisions of huge companies may have an effect even on entire societies. The idea what kind of financial tools are allowed in Wall Street created major problems for economies all over the world, and even some countries were, nearly to be kicked out of the Eurozone, for instance, with the Greeks. So things are interconnected. And even when we are right now in the process where states lean back and consider to renationalize competences, so to limit the amount of globalization and international exchange, what we have reached so far has caused several situations where we are mutually dependent to each other. There's this image that nobody takes care when a bag of rice falls to the ground somewhere in China. But if this is a huge amount of bags of rice and it causes some problems in global nutrition, then it has an effect. So we must be careful in that regard. And maybe in these fields, this classical idea of sovereignty and being an actor and having an army is less important, and other qualities are requested and expected to be an actor or an entity that is of importance in a certain field of politics. And another thing that is, I think, quite important, that not in every example, I think North Korea is the best example that does not fit to what comes next, that transnational politics diminishes nation states' ability to be the gatekeeper of external politics. So the classical idea is that finally a state represented by its government is responsible for all external policies. This doesn't hold true in most cases, because not every financial transaction of a company must be approved by a government. That's usually not the case. That in many situations no longer possible, especially it's not possible for a European Union that forms a common market, open borders that usually suspends due to the Schengen Agreement, border controls and all of this. So the state might claim that the state still is the final entity that has to decide about external relations, but it's no longer possible in a more transnational scenario that the European Union is exposed to. And of course, what I mentioned before, this private economic governance complements public governments. Right now, in the search for medicine and vaccine for the COVID disease and other situations, you have to cooperate with private companies, and the social responsibility of private business is also something that adds up. One example in here would be the idea of sustainable development, that you make the economy and the conditions for consumption and production economically sound and also socially just, is something that cannot be commanded or ordered by state authorities. It must be understood by societies, but that must also be understood by companies who change their strategy. In the long time, you have a change, but this creates another form of mutual dependencies within such a setting. And because the structure of international politics no more is the structure of the ending of World War II or something else, but a structure that has changed, this formalistic negation, hey, you are not a state, you are not sovereign, is maybe no longer leading to a real assessment of the European Union and its activeness, and might be maybe overly simplistic. The term sovereignty is quite important. What's the difference between sovereignty and competence? Anyone? The difference between sovereignty and competence.
sovereignty is basically the state's ability to take its own decisions without being forced to do that by any other actor, other states or other power. But about competence, I'm not that sure. Like it sounds the same some extent, but I think competence is like less. Sovereignty is more like for a state or for some actor, but competence is like for international organizations or something like that. I'm not sure.
Can you understand when someone speaks in the room, Linus? Now we can't hear you. Is your mic on?
Probably when you. Can you hear me?
Now, yeah. It's interrupted, so it's not a permanent connection. So I just repeated. So Huda was a little bit confused that the term sovereignty seems to be more clear and higher, sharper, while competence sounds similar, but maybe is less in terms of meaning or importance. The relationship between sovereignty and competence is indeed a tricky one. Sovereignty, foremost, is a legal concept. I think it can be referred back to this Westphalian peace that established modern statehood and created the conditions for sovereignty, that you have to respect the sovereignty of another entity and that you do not intervene, which became one of the most important norms in international politics and is one of the major norms of the United Nations Charter, so that a state is perceived to be sovereign. But sovereignty, it's a legal conception. So you are sovereign to do whatever you want to do in your state. You have territory, you have a clear population, and you have the right to do. That's sovereignty. Competence means you are capable of action. So, as a member state of the European Union, Malta usually is perceived as a sovereign state. According to international law, Malta is a sovereign state. But there are so many things that Malta cannot do, but which the European Union can do because of size, economic weight, power. So there are many things that the European Union can fix, while Malta, Cyprus, maybe even Germany cannot fix this. And this applies also to the big member states. So the argument for the British, among many others, to leave the European Union, we want to have our own trade deals, which are better ones, which are better fitting for us as British economy. 2018, so it was at the edge 2017-18, and 1 year later, 18-19, the European Union renewed its negotiations for the trade relations with Japan, which is now a very comprehensive free trade agreement, which includes many forms of investment, the protection of intellectual property rights, and all these things. It's a comprehensive one. And the conditions for the European Union are quite good. So both entities found consensus, Japan and the European Union. At the same time, the Brits invited the Japanese trade minister and asked for an offer for a trade agreement between UK and Japan once the UK is fully outside the European Union, outside the internal market, outside the customs union. And they got an offer. But this offer was much weaker than the offer for the European Union. And the Brits asked the Japanese, hey, it's a weaker offer, why? You're smaller, you're less important. So the competence here to get the same was gone for the Brits, because they didn't speak on behalf of a 500 billion internal market, but just for the British economy. And this is, in many situations, the thing. The European Union can set standards for external taxation, for instance, can set standards for international companies that invest or come over to Europe, which small member states, maybe individual states, all cannot do. So competence is ability, the capability to fix a certain problem. Sovereignty is to imagine that you have the competence. But there is no guarantee that you have it, because it's a legal conception. You are sovereign, yes, but there are situations where you cannot even pay a glass of water for your sovereignty, because your sovereignty is a legal concept. But the material dimension of certain policy problems are subject to a competence that in a given situation you may not hold. So
sovereignty is a sheer description.
The sovereignty is quite important because as a member state of the European Union, for instance, you are sovereign, and you do have a sovereignty according to Article 50 to say go away. But the question is my salary matching with the competence that I require to get certain things done?
Yeah, competence in this sense is more important.
And then competence, at least it is more of practical importance. Yeah, when you refer back to the Brexit campaigns, they were highlighting and emphasizing British sovereignty. The argument, yes, but certain things you can't do without, was unheard. Or yes, but we want to be independent. We want to be British again. That was more important. We will see what it finally will mean for the European Union. I would like to continue with ingredients of this debate of activeness in international law. So, as I've mentioned a few minutes before, international law refers to principles like territoriality, sovereignty, and international law recognizes, like in theories, states to be the highest entity in international politics. That can be an international organization, but this international organization is due to a contract that was by a consensus made by a group of states, universal, UN, or smaller parts of the world. This is what is today understood as the Western system of nation states. When we come back to international relations theory, we'll come back to realism and neorealism. The idea behind realism and neorealism is indeed states are the highest entity in international politics, which means there is no entity higher than the state that, for instance, can guarantee my safety. Yeah, within states, usually we have the monopoly of force, the monopoly of power, which does not apply to the level or order beyond the member state. Therefore, security comes into play, power comes into play, because I have to help myself in the case of cases. The finding of realism is that the situation beyond the level of the nation state is anarchy. But anarchy is not to be confused and mixed with chaos. Anarchy can be very stable because of power distribution, for instance. That's the argument by realists. This is a little bit the description that we also find in international law. International law acknowledges the importance of international organizations, like we've mentioned before. And international organizations can be a sponsor or a source that provokes and requests the expansion of international law, so they can foster this. But finally, they are just working on a mandate that is landed from the member state. So it's not a clear no, but of course it's not a clear yes, that international organizations have something like activeness. For the European Union, for a long time, the European community told themselves in the treaty, we have legal personality, which means we are capable of signing treaties, contracts, agreements with other entities outside the European Union. What is the prerequisite for the European Union to do so? What is the prerequisite that the European Union cannot only say we claim that we have legal personality, but what makes this legal personality something valid? What is required, even by the European Union, saying we hold legal personality?
Member states should first mandate.
Member states is quite clear. Member states, it's quite clear. Could you please say? I just have to go to the comment section. Linus wrote in the chat. Supranationality. That refers to what the EU needs to have internally. But when you claim that you hold legal personality in community politics and you can negotiate, trade with external partners and sign a contract that is valid for all your member states, you need recognition. The other guys must recognize you.
Okay.
This is very important. If the other guys ignore you, no, I'm not going to Brussels. I'm calling my friends in Berlin, and next I travel to Paris, then you do have a problem. Hey, I'm the one who holds legal personality. What in the case of the European Union, Berlin and Paris Hotel, sorry, wrong number. It's the guy in Brussels. They are the competent entity, not we any longer.
Okay.
And in this interplay between sovereignty and competence, for the long time, the argument by European integration was we upload sovereignty to the European level, or we share sovereignty with the European level, or we pool sovereignty. Meanwhile, we speak of competence. We give competence to the European Union to do something on our behalf. We remain sovereign because ultimately we can still deactivate our membership and leave the European Union due to Article 70, which usually nobody would aim to do, apart from the Brits, the odd Brits. They are. This legal personality requires recognition by the others, but this recognition can be more or less urged by competence. When the European Union is the competent level, then the word of the member state is maybe less important, especially you can't sign a treaty with them. And with the Lisbon Treaty, we have this abandoned pillar structure of the European Union. So with the Lisbon Treaty, the entire European Union holds legal personality. And because of this legal personality, the European community, and now after Lisbon, the European Union, is a contracting partner to several international treaties. Sometimes it's the European Union signing for all the member states. In most cases, we have a parallel signatory status, which means member states sign an international convention, an international agreement, and the European Union does as well. And this also requires the recognition of the other negotiation partners to allow the European Union to be a signatory power to an international contract. So I skipped the question for state recognition. Maybe we can address this a little later. Yes. So when you, I think the Israeli-Palestine conflict is a telling story in that regard. We have, for the European dimension, we have Kosovo, entities, Palestine, Kosovo, many others, West Sahara, many others, so it's not a single Palestinian issue. Claim we want to be sovereign and we want to be recognized as independent sovereign states. Who can grant you such recognition? Who can do so?
International.
Javier first.
International institutions such as the UN, and they have to give up permission for the person just to be a complete sovereign state.
Where do we find this? In the Charter of the United Nations?
In the General Assembly?
No. So the General Assembly is the convention club of the members of the United Nations. But where do we find it in the Charter? That it is written that the UN is the entity that can give you recognition as a sovereign state.
Yeah.
International law?
Yeah, the Charter is part of international law. So the uncomfortable answer is there is no entity in the globe that got the task and the job to decide about sovereignty and recognition of states. It's not there. What we have is the qualification criterion for entering the United Nations is you must be a sovereign state. So this is taken as a proxy. Once they allow me membership and I'm sitting together with the others in the assembly, I'm a recognized state. And what I am. The Palestinians know the situations, Western Sahara knows the situation, Kosovo, a very tricky situation. Parts of the members of the European Union have recognized Kosovo as a follow-up of former Yugoslavia, an independent state, others not.
The same goes for Palestine.
So When you look into the stability agreement, the stability and association agreement that the European Union signed in support of Kosovo, the stability agreements in the beginning were meant for peacekeeping after the ending of violence in this former Yugoslavian war scenarios. When you look into the stability and association agreement with Kosovo, it looks like the preparation of membership. But you can't prepare membership with an entity like Kosovo when nearly half of the members of the European Union is not recognizing Kosovo as a member. So it's a very tricky thing. But usually the point of reference when you ask for who is to be understood as sovereign is the United Nations. According to this criteria, you must be a state to be accepted as a member of United Nations. The European Union cannot be a member, even though in many situations, in many regards, the European Union is a more important partner to play with for the United Nations because it holds competence, budgets, all these things that are important in trade policy, in agricultural policy, development cooperation, all these things. And therefore, the European Union is officially an observer, has an observer status to the United Nations, but the right is permanent admittance to the UN buildings. So it's very important to be present in there and to have the allowance to go in the buildings where you want to. And there is one special category that was established by the United Nations. It's the Regional Economic Integration Organization. And I think it's still the situation that the European Union is the only one who fits into that pattern really. So we have to decide about the differentiation between legal personality, which to a certain extent matches with sovereignty. Yeah, this is important because this gives you the right, for instance, to sign treaties. But the treaty is worthless where you can't act. So the capability is very important, and the capability can be understood as competence to do certain things. Yeah. So international law gives us some ideas what to think about, but it does not equip us with a fully fledged understanding or definition what activeness for an endeavor like the European Union could be and could mean. So we have to go a little bit ahead, and I have to take care of time, as I just realized. I've already mentioned realism, so I can make this story very short. Realists are by mindset state-centric. They perceive states as entities and therefore actors, and of course realists usually are interested in power constellations, so they look into big or important or powerful states and non-state actors, and for such the European Union would be not a state, therefore a non-state actor is only of minor importance. The text, the chapter, I think on the first page, refers to some writing and makes an ironic comment that sometimes state-centric theories struggle to admit that the European Union has a say. Because of course they realize we are talking about global economy, we're talking about global finance, we're talking about the capacity, for instance, to achieve an international agreement. This is what the European Union can, even though it's not elected. So they try to squeeze it into patterns where the European Union does not belong to. Maybe it would be more interesting and more wise to look into reconfigurations of your theory. And a little bit the same it applies to the neorealists sort. And neorealists have another explanation for the existence and for the competence of the European Union. The argument by some neorealists is the European Union, the European integration process could happen because of the constellation of the East-West conflict. While the US took care of Europe's security and defense, the Europeans found some spare time to do other things and form the integration process that was otherwise not possible. So also, when we talk about competence and activeness of the European Union, it's only because other entities took care of certain important things like security and defense. We now are maybe coming to the ending of the administration of Donald Trump, but I think the lesson learned for many Europeans was maybe we have to take care of our security and defense businesses by ourselves and no longer be fully dependent on the security guarantee that was promised by the United States. We will see. But of course, the European Union is something that has significance, it's an economic power, but only due to the confirmation of the great thinking of neo-realist sort, because they took care, the US took care of European security. A tricky finding, but once you remain a state-centric theory and you do not admit that the European Union is coming very close to something like a state, you have difficulties to grasp what the European Union actually is, and you can't come to an easy answer what the activeness of the Union could be. And I can make the second story also short because I already referred to the mindset of institutionalists who define hate. The world that we are looking to is not a world that is dominantly structured by anarchy, where we have to take care of our security and achieve power. Most of the problems are problems out of complex interdependence. So an economic concern in one part of the world can have consequences for other parts of the world. For instance, turmoil in currency policies and stuff like this. Think of climate change, think of other environmental threats that do not respect national borders. For this, we need processes of institutionalization. So they realize that the European Union is something of importance. But in the long run, they also argue, like international law, they also argue that finally the power of the European Union, like for other international organizations, is a power that comes due to the sovereignty of the member states. So it can be subject to withdrawal. They can revoke what they gave. Mm-hmm. And when you look to this Eurosceptic turn in Europe, when you look to Brexit, some people rethink the idea, maybe we should end all this project. I sometimes think maybe we should abandon it as it is right now and find some like-minded states to do it in a better version. Mm-hmm. But I think you would right now only find 2 or 3 states that would do something similar today. Quite risky. So institutionalists have another perception. They recognize the importance of international organizations and integration projects like the European Union, that even can be a security actor, because the idea that the Europeans fight against each other is quite absent. So the European Union is a security community in that sense. But these international cooperation structures that form international organizations do not replace the international order, where states are the highest entity. So in the long run, they more align to realist thinking than to constructivist thinking or others. The authors refer 1 or 2 times, hey, maybe we have to go away from state-centric theories and we have to take into consideration more behavioral logics of IR thinking without really explaining what they are. This term behavioralism in international relations is a rather complex one. One element of behavioralism in international relations is that you do not look to the power structures or the result of a certain policy process, but you look to the process. Mm-hmm. And the behavioral alignment and adjustment to a given process that informs much more about the capability of getting things done and being an actor. And here's a rather old sketch, the world system theory of Immanuel Wallerstein. So we are by theory back in the 70s, where we had 3 big economic blocks worldwide. The world still was divided into East and West. For our European thinking, we were not thinking about China, India at that time. So the idea that China and India are emerging markets was pretty absent at that time. They were somehow there and important, but less for our own well-being every day. And according to the world system theory, international relations were at that time predominantly coined by, for instance, trade competition, The three blocks have been North America with the US elite. Later NAFTA was formed to have an institutional frame for such a market. Japan, tiny but very influential, connected with other Asian economies and very export-oriented. And we had the Europeans. And of course, for the Europeans, it was quite clear, if we do it separated, divided we fall, united we stand, we have to do it. So the idea was for the others, for the US, to be leading in the North American bloc. Doesn't change anything. We are sovereign, we do what we want. For Japan, we do what we want. For the Europeans, no, we have to do it collectively. So we have to form a community. This is the idea that for the Europeans, for the member states of the European community and the European Union, this integration project was the tool to organize relations in trade and commercial policies with the US and with Japan. And this then, of course, means they want to have activeness for the European Union, because in such a cooperation, you do not want to be in a minor role. One expression that this still is something rather valid was the Lisbon strategy. The Lisbon strategy, at the end of the 90s, beginning 2000s, the European Union didn't know how to reactivate its economy. So the promises of German reunification were somehow gone. The Germans were considered with themselves, how do we get the East a flourishing territory, and there was kind of recession across the European continent, high rates of employment. So what the European Union said, okay, we have to foster innovation, we have to foster technology, we have to invest much more in development, because we want to become the most competitive economic entity in the world. So the idea was, we do have problems, we have to get rid of the problems, but we can't do separately. We must do it together. That was an intergovernmental agreement, the Lisbon strategy, but later adopted by the institutions in Brussels. So this world system theory, in global competition, the best thing is, hey, we consider who we are, and yes, Germany maybe is very good in export, but when the other Europeans don't purchase German cars, we are looking rather poorly into our future. So what we have to do is we have to take care that the European Union is a strong entity and that it is competitive in the international scenario. Anyone who knows something about Robert Cox and neo-Gramscianism? Ever heard before? I was a little bit surprised that they integrate something. It's in a Marxist tradition. Gramsci was a representative of the Socialist or Communist Party in Italy during the fascist regime, Mussolini regime. He was in prison, and all his thought, his socialist Marxist thought, was written down in so-called the German term is Gefängnishefte, prison folders. So you have to search among several papers what his idea is about. I, for myself, for my dissertation, I searched for his term of civil society, because for him, civil society is the place where strong economic interests persuade the society to follow the market logic, because economic growth is better than maybe socialist distribution of commodities and goods. So for him, the term hegemony is very important. Neo-Gramscianism comes from a Marxist position, which tries to understand the world due to its material forces. For instance, markets are to be understood as a force, like other forces that are named armed forces, military. And for Robert Cox, an American IR theorist, globalization was a dominant process, and the European Union was facing difficulties because the democratic state does want to have, for instance, social welfare pretty high. But when you are, as the European Union, exposed to global competition, lowering taxes, creating best conditions for international investment, then you have to turn into a neoliberal state. And for the European member states, it was quite nice that this menacing to turn into a neoliberal state was done by the European Union and not by the member states, because politicians want to be re-elected. And then I can say, yes, but because it's the European Union, global competition, we have to do so. Finally, it's the idea of there. But what is important in the thinking of Robert Cox is that there is a separation or a disjuncture of economic, which are non-territorial policies, and military, territorial policies. And the examples that Cox in his writing refers to is that the US still is conducting warfare, with a little minor European contributions, for instance, by the British, and that the Europeans agree, we do so, we still support you as a NATO, we do not engage that very much, but we take care of the restoration of the destroyed territory afterwards. This worked in 1990, Iraq, Kuwait. This worked no longer. In 2003, the renewed intervention into Iraq, where Europe got divided about the question to support the US or not. So this highlights that the European Union is an important actor, but with a completely different mindset. The US foreign policy analyst Cannon wrote a paper where he argued that the European Union lives in Kantian paradise, so a group of republics that group together and think how can we improve our relations and get the best conditions for the livings of our people. He used the image of Venus, which represents love, and for the US, still engaged in making war, he referred to the thinking of Hobbes and this violent-driven nature condition that the US is exposed to. They still have to fight, and they gave them the name Mars and Venus. So this is the same image with other connections that Cox used for the description of the European Union to explain why for the member states of the European Union, the European integration process is a very important tool, and this gives activeness to the European Union. Somehow logical, but not one crystal clear definition of how to understand the European Union, because Robert Cox or Gramsci, neo-Gramscianism, was referring to the European Union when it still was the European Community, and they were not aware of the idea that the European Union would create foreign policy and European security and defense policy. Of course, what is always a vital option is to refer to social constructivism, where the intersubjective structure gives meaning to material ones. What is meant by this little tiny sentence, intersubjective structure gives meaning to material ones? So the intersubjective meanings would be the member states representatives, want the European Union to do a certain thing, to get a problem solved, to fix a certain issue. And when they want the European Union to do it, they will stay away from the option to do it by themselves. Yeah? And this opens the material dimension. Hey, European Union, you are in charge. And this is in parts, the overall idea behind social constructivism in international relations theory. Usually the idea is, according to realists and many others, that the structure shapes the behavior of the agents. States are agents, and because the structure of international relations is anarchy, they have to take care of the power and security situation. Constructivists would argue, how can a state be the highest entity, and this is not changeable? States are created by whom?
People.
By men.
Yeah.
So men should be capable of doing something maybe beyond the level of the state. And then the intersubjective will or perception of reality would construct a new reality. And this is social construction of reality. We want to end the situation of anarchy beyond the state level, and we create something that maybe leads to state government, world government. We do not know what kind of term for. Nobody has a clear plan. Global governance is one step to create a set of law that to a certain extent dominates the states, that ends anarchy and allows much more allows to anticipate what's going to happen. There's one element in international law that is named democratic peace. And the idea is that democracies do not fight against each other. So you won't start war against another democracy. And there are many, many elements that fuel this argument that democracies do not go to war against each other. One is, for instance, that usually the decision to fight a war is a democratic one. And this consumes time and creates public debate about it. So you cannot, easily enter into another country, surprise, surprise, because, that's long-term perspective perceivable that you are aiming to attack your neighboring country. But even more important is that in the mindset of your people, to attack another democracy, hey, they are like we, they are like-minded, is something impossible, really unthinkable. So this is a set of elements in the democratic peace scenario. This is also a certain form of social construction of reality. We do not want to fight a war against each other. If a non-democracy would do something mean, maybe the decision to get into sanctions or the announcement of forceful means would be much easier, but not among democracies. This is also how you construct your worldview, and by this change the structure of international politics. So constructivism, of course, is able to understand the legal reservations that lawyers, but also other things have with the European Union, because finally everything comes from the member states. Nevertheless, they come to the idea that in many situations it is the EU that speaks up for the member states. It's the EU that holds competence to get certain things fixed. So it's the EU that is an important actor beyond the European realm and an important global actor. What also is an argument is that the European Union, even though the claim is that it is an international organization or an international governmental organization, it is a sui generis actor, so it's the one of its own. There is no other example, and therefore we have to treat the EU differently than other international governmental organizational entities. And this argument by Rucci, this multi-perspectival polity, is what I explained before. In some situations you are not certain about who is in charge of a certain decision. Is it the EU level? Is it the member state level? Is it somebody else? This is quite important. So in sum, we can say that international relations theory as well as international law deliver but an incomplete image of what EU activeness is about. But of course there is quite a lot of information that informs us we have to look into processes to understand whether or not we can understand the European Union as an actor or not. And this is what we're going to do in the seminar in the coming weeks and months to figure out. What Breston and Vogler do, and this is even done a little bit more extensive in this article that I have mentioned at the beginning about the Kyoto process, is that they discuss briefly some conceptions of how to understand the activeness. The debate about activeness is a long-lasting one. It started in the 70s when the European Community, via the European Commission, started to negotiate with certain entities international agreement. The question was, how? Do they really dare to sign an international treaty? We are sovereign states. They can't do so. And finally, courts told the member states, yes, but you gave sovereignty, at the time sovereignty, you gave competence to the EU level, so they can do so. And this provoked in political science, in economic science, in legal studies, the debate about the activeness of the European Union. Bretherton and Vogler suggest a threefold structure to figure out what to think about the EU. Is the European Union an actor? And the first is opportunity, the structural context of ideas and events which enable or constrain EU external action. This has several dimensions. And one dimension is, of course, when the others have the idea that the European Union is completely unimportant, it gets tricky for the European Union to get a step into the door. When the others realize it doesn't make sense to talk to the capitals of the member states, the situation improves. So everything that has to do with neoliberal or liberal markets and globalization is covered by the competences of the European Union, and this is the playing field, the level playing field for the European Union. Here the Union will be capable to gain actors. Mm-hmm. Another scenario was, for instance, with the ending of the East-West conflict and the transformation in the eastern and southeastern part of Europe, the European Union was one attractive entity to talk to. Who was the other attractive entity to talk to? The European Union and?
What the question is? What the question is?
So the European Union, after the ending of the East-West conflict, was an attractive partner to talk to for the Eastern and Central Eastern European countries. Who was the other entity that was important and attractive? Who they want to join? Think from a Polish perspective. Think from a Lithuanian perspective.
Russia?
Russia? No.
Soviet? No.
Russia? No. Russia was the cause that the other one would have talked to.
Yeah.
NATO and US.
NATO, yeah.
So there was this double importance of meeting people, the one from the European Union, or to talk to the Germans, to get access to Brussels, and of course to talk to Washington and to get membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because yes, the Russian Federation in the beginning was benevolent and leaving them to develop their sovereignty. But when Russia wants to regain power and maybe getting hold again of them, so the one entity to protect us is, of course, NATO. And this is still the situation in Poland. In Romania, people think like this. In the Baltic states, this is something which is not contested, that NATO membership is quite important. What most of the countries didn't realize is that NATO membership is expensive. You have to purchase military capacities, and who is the seller? Usually it's the US, to a less extent European arms industry. It's quite important. So I was present in Romania when Romania first joined NATO, and the Romanian public got a little bit upset when they realized that there's a huge harbor, a military harbor next to Constanța, where the US were sending some ships and were elaborating a permanent military mission, but they realized that the Romanian state had to pay for this, and this was quite expensive. And then they realized, okay, maybe we should have taken more care of our membership in the European Union, then we maybe would have joined in 2004 or 2007 as well. But of course, this setting of the ending of the East-West conflict gave attractiveness to the European Union because they wanted to be members of the club. And because they wanted to be members of the club, they accepted the conditions for membership. And this gave the European Union the opportunity to shape what happened in the east and southern east of Europe. And this is what we can maybe conceive as activeness, so especially the pre-accession process. They have quite a lot of activeness and competence to the European Union. And what the European Union experienced with this pre-accession policy, which to a large extent was successful, is something that they later copy-pasted to the naval policy. So the naval policy, to a certain extent, is following the logics. What the European Union realized is not giving any opportunity to be an actor, or an important actor, was of course the experience of the wars in the Balkans, where they were looking surprised and not knowing how to tackle with the situation. So entire former Yugoslavia was a problem. And the same happened in the aftermath of September 11, and especially the military intervention into Iraq in 2003, where the European member states were pretty divided, and Donald Rumsfeld came along and divided Europe into old and new Europe. New Europe, those who followed the US-led coalition, old Europe, countries like like Germany, like France, and some others, Belgium as well, Luxembourg as well. So everything that is matching with the competences given to the European Union via the treaties is something where the European Union can develop activeness once the Union wants to develop activeness. There are more conditions. The other one element is presence, the ability to exert influence externally to shape the behavior of others. But when you want to shape the behavior of others, you first must get to the conviction we want to do it as Europeans.
Mm-hmm.
So presence is something that also connects to the idea we want to have the European identity to do something as Europeans and not divided and separated. And again, this is of course something that is most connected to the single market. And of course also meanwhile to the Euro and the Eurozone for those members who are members to the Eurozone club. And that might be mitigated by some internal factors, efficacy and legitimacy. Legitimacy is important. I've mentioned this, I think, in this class as well. When you do something that has an external dimension and you sign contracts and treaties with partners, this is in the mindset of the people usually something that your government does, but not some people in Brussels we do not know and we can't pronounce their names. So it's much more recognition by the people when what the European Union at least intends to do something positive.
Yeah.
That you take care that human rights are respected. When you take care that democratic elections in the country are respected by the regime and so on. So if that, what you do, is connected with positive images by the people, this gains much more legitimacy, because legitimacy is not only that you have the legal competence to do something, but somehow people get the impression what they do is right. And I would do the same in such a situation. So presence is a certain pillar. We will come back to this later in the seminar and repeat these things. Capability is the internal context of EU action or inaction. When the treaties provide the European Union to do something, then the European Union can do something and be an influential actor. When you first must find a consensus among 27 member states, and then somebody claims, what about the costs? Then maybe your action is too late and you are not able to do so. And then the union's capability describes the union's ability to capitalize, to materialize presence and respond to opportunity. But this is dependent to a shared commitment to norms and values. So when you do something that is not according to your norms and values, you are getting into problems. In this seminar, we are not talking about the idea that the European Union is a military entity. But for many members of the European Union, as well as for many citizens of the European Union should not turn to a military entity. So the decision in the Libyan crisis to not take over the mandate of the United Nations and get active military-wise in Libya was appreciated by most. So if the Union would have done that, it would have not met the norms of many of the member states, but also not many of the expectations of the citizens. So this is also something you are maybe physically, materially capable, but you should think twice before you activate your capabilities. This has to do with legitimacy and priority. And of course, it has to do with consistency and coherence. So what you do should be consistent policy and not deciding all the time with double standards, or the one is undermining the other policy. This is what the European Union very often does. One example, the European Union, I said this, is one of the most important donors in international development cooperation. It's European budget, European money that is spent in here, but also the money of the member states. And the Union, for instance, used quite a lot of money to support artisanal fisheries in Western Africa. So that the fish that is extracted by artisanal fishers is a source of protein and for the nutrition situation in this area. Because what comes next to the ocean is the Wahrheit zone. So it's semi-arid. You can't have so much food production in that area. So it's something that might support the development of the region, that you have cooling facilities, better boats, some education for the young fishers and stuff like this. At the same time, the European Union was signing fishery agreements with the respective governments to allow European trawlers to enter the sea of Ghana, Senegal, and other Western African states, and to extract fish and compete with the artisanal fishers. That doesn't make sense. It's completely inconsistent, but it's done. So activeness in those, but here in this example, conflicted activeness. Finally, capability is the availability and utilization of policy tools given to the European level. Then the European Union is able to do something. So what to keep in mind until here? Neither international law nor international relations theory struck us with a distinct definition, so we always have to reflect in a given situation. I do not need to read the slide, what the theories think about. What we will do in the class is we will discuss certain foreign policy situations, external relations situations to be more precise, and we will reflect about what the European Union is doing, what's going on. We will try to understand the process, and maybe not in every case we can come to a definition according to opportunity, presence, and capability, what we have to think about the activeness of the European Union. So the opportunity, that will depend on the cases that we discuss about, neighborhood policy, democracy promotion, external dimension of energy policy. Presence has something to do with the self-image of the European Union, what kind of entity do they want to be, what is the identity to going abroad. This I will introduce next week to you, and the abilities, the capabilities we will discuss from case to case in the weeks to come. And I want you to look on your watches. You see, it's exact 4, so very precisely. Okay, I stop sharing my presentation. I guess then you can see. No, I should end the presentation mode, sir. And now we are back. So you can see our guest via video conferencing. Any final question you have?
No.
Until here.
So here, no. No questions.
Okay, then thank you very much for today. See you again in this configuration next week. And yes, we for the studies sake of things will be tomorrow the master for, right? Okay. Linus, bye-bye. Next week the same. I organize the conference.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we have to work on your audio connection. That's interrupted all the time, so we can't hear you permanently.
Okay.
Okay. See you next week.